Thank you. Well, it's lovely, instead of Zoom and Skype, to be looking at a live audience here. Almost the first time for me for 2 years. If you look a bit less alive after the next hour, it'll be my fault. This is this strange river. And I was astonished to find that when I talked about the Amur River, almost nobody had ever heard of it. It's the 10th longest river in the world, drains a basin twice the size of Pakistan, and is the only great Russian river that flows west-east. Years ago, the Russians and Chinese convened together to try to decide where the furthest source of the river was, hoping, of course, that it would lie in their own territory. But they found to their chagrin that it arose instead in the mountains of northeast Mongolia, down here. And that's where my journey started.
I want to ask you about whether you do much planning, because in the Amur River, which I'll talk about first, there's a moment where even the horsemen don't know where you're going and you're off the road.
You can't, honestly. It's the sort of journey that was unplannable. So I had 2 very tough Mongolian horsemen and a guide. And the rangers of the border of that area said, you can't go, it's too dangerous. But I, of course, desperately wanted to go. In the end, we had to sign documents absolving them of any responsibility for us. And off we went. And there's no earthly way to know where on earth you're going to end up for the night. It's an empty area, there's nobody there. And the horse has unfortunately panicked. Because they weren't used to marshland. They were those little tough Mongol horses that want the hard step. Mine rolled on me and threw me several times, and I came out with 2 broken ribs and a bust ankle. But I suppose I persuaded myself that the ankle was only sprained and the ribs were only bruised. And otherwise I'd have had to go back to London. They'd have x-rayed it. I'd have lost a year of my life. At my age, I couldn't afford to.
I read it with increasing disbelief. I'll just reel off the fact that on page 73, you felt like you'd had a stroke. You hadn't, but you felt that debilitated. You were arrested on page 79. Your car went off the road, not your fault, someone else was driving. And by page 145, I think your speech was a bit deranged, you said. You didn't know whether to speak. I think you were missing the fluency of Russian, you said.
Yeah.
One thing I really want to ask you about is the attitudes between Russia and China, and you've got a long history with these countries.
It's a complicated history, but in the late 17th century, Russia and China met, and neither had a clue about the other. Peter the Great was back in Moscow as a teenager. They eventually made a treaty, but they couldn't speak each other's language, and the treaty had to be conducted in Latin by 2 Jesuit priests on the side of the Chinese and a learned Pole on the side of the Russians. And it was agreed that the whole of the Amur River and all the huge swathe of land to the north belonged to China. The Russians seized it back in the mid-19th century. They just took it. China, after all, got all its lands back from the predatory colonial powers like Britain, France. Only Russia has never given back those lands that it usurped. And so there's a sort of standoff between them. They don't meet much. There's very little intermarriage. But up here, as you proceed into Russia by various interesting detours, you find right at the top there that it meets the Argun, and this is where it becomes the Chinese-Russian border. For well over 1,000 miles, this great loop down there is to the south China, to the north Siberian Russia. The Chinese call it the Heilongjiang, the Black Dragon River. To the Russians, it's no longer the Holy Mother Onon. It's had a change of gender and become Little Father Amur. And then sweeps down here in this long and very vulnerable for the Russians borderland with the multitudes of China down here. Down here, 110 million Chinese in the provinces abutting the river, facing just 2 million Russians on the other side.
Do you think shamanism is still going in Siberia?
It's hard to say because I didn't really meet any serious shamans. The only honest answer is that in this area, I don't know. It probably does, and there's an element of it in remoter parts than the Amur even. What happened, of course, in the Russian period was that they extinguished it, or thought they had, and you find the local communities. The schools that the children were forced to go to were often boarding schools, miles from where their parents were, I mean literally hundreds of miles sometimes. Their parents were probably reindeer herders or remote farmers, and the children would go to Russian schools, be taught the virtues of Soviet communism, and then after perhaps 9 months go back to some sort of holiday with their family completely estranged. And it made for a terrible disjunction in the society. But the Russians imagined certainly that they had extinguished shamanism. A few shamans' huts were pointed out to me sometimes along the Amur River, but they were empty. But I think it does survive. If there are two things people know about the Amur, I think it's first that down here on the Ussuri tributary, there's a little place called Janbar, where it's an island, a sort of island. It's really a sandbank, and it's where the Russians and Chinese fought a war together during the Cultural Revolution. It was quietly, the Russians cleared it of Chinese with a massive bombardment, and then years later, in the Putin period, it was very quietly given back to China, but it's just a little sandbank, and people heard of that as this Ussuri conflict. The other thing people have heard about, of course, is the Amur tiger, and that lives here in these mountains. A beautiful beast. I never saw one. You'd be very lucky to, and it is endangered. But it's sort of stabilized at about 450 of these great animals.
I want to take you back, for those who don't know, to the Damascus books. And there's the 50th anniversary edition is over there of it with a new introduction. How do you feel about that book now?
I have a sort of affection for it, as for first love. It was tremendously exciting. I didn't know anything about Arab urban culture. I've been attracted to it by a short visit beforehand. But I went and I settled with an Arab family on the street called Strait, an old carpenter. And it was a wonderful time. Damascus was terribly cheap. Everybody was hospitable. In the mid-1960s, it seemed to be not exactly flourishing because Beirut was the great center in those days. The old buildings were mesmerizing, made a lot of friends among Syrian students speaking English. And so I have a sort of affection for it that you have with the romance of the first, a wonderful first visit.
Is it true you went back 3 years ago, which seems improbable, to Damascus?
Yes.
How did you get in? I mean, wasn't it rather dangerous?
It was, and it wasn't very wise of me. I flew to Beirut and went over the mountains by taxi. I had a sort of permission from a woman who was the cultural minister, if you like, of the Syrian regime, which I'd secured through a journalist friend. And that was the one contact I have. But I didn't know how powerful she was or what my reception would be like. Damascus seemed terribly sad. All the old vitality, the hospitality had gone. Many of the streets looked closed down, but the buildings were all there. Within the old city walls, all the old buildings I loved, the madrasas, the mosques, the palaces, almost undamaged. And that was wonderful. That was a sort of compensation to me. Always. So I felt quite nostalgic. I was picked up by the secret police and shoved in jail for a few hours only. But I didn't know what the relative power of the cultural secretary and the secret police was. It didn't seem very promisingly in my favour, I have to say. But they did eventually let me go.
That sounds frightening. I mean, I remember in the 1986 interview with Sue Lawley, she asked your most dangerous moments, and you quote the Muslim mob, and you said you were rather ashamed to say you pretended to be French.
Yes.
And
finally, the river finds its exit there in the Okhotsk Sea on the Pacific, and by that time it's become as desolate as at any time in its course, because it's almost unnavigable. It's very shallow, it's vast, miles across, but shallow and hard for any ship of deep draught to manage.
Does your wife allow this now, because you're married now? How does she feel? It's a question many people must be asking about you doing this.
I think she's quite fatalistic.
Right.
I'm quite
Just
glad
as
she's
well.
not here. She knows how important it is to me. And she understands what work is because she's a Shakespearean scholar.
Yeah.
She knows what it means to be isolated writing. She accepts that I'm a little bit mad.
It's not just because you couldn't travel, but because you couldn't get the solitude you need to write so much, which reminded me of the Balzac quote in the Woody Allen film after he slept with Diane Keaton, and he says, "There goes another novel." But,
well, we've been an item, as the Americans say, I think, for 25 years now.
oh, that's quite a long time.
But fairly long.
Yeah, lots of people have all sorts of reasons why they become a traveller like this.
It's rather undramatic, really. I didn't hate Eton and I didn't love it. I suppose in particular, I mean, I think all such schools, secondary schools, are boys only. And they're boys really pretending to be men. You know, the ideal is to be a man. You're superior to everything. You're sort of above it.
Yeah.
And Eton was very bad for this, that you were above, whether it was world, poverty, politics, God, or indeed your own shortcomings. There's a kind of pretense of mastery. And that didn't go down well with me, really, at all. I cared too much about things. And, I think we see in some of our political leaders the same phenomenon.
It's funny, yeah. It's a funny thing because you could say that here's a travel writer who's a white man who went to Eton, and to me that's a form of underprivilege. What you went through there. I'm going to quote very briefly, and I had to replay it on BBC Sounds to hear what you said because it was so wonderful about Eton. Ritualised uncaringness, the apotheosis of character above everything, world problems, culture, which does strike a chord, doesn't it? The Mountain in Tibet book is Colin circumambulating Mount Kailash in Tibet, which is the great sacred mountain to, I think, 3 or 4 religions, because the Ganges. And many people said you suddenly sort of put yourself into that book and the loss of your parents. I mean, I want to ask you one thing about that. What have you done about your parents' love letters? Because you debate in the book, and many of us would have had this. Do you read them? It's a strange feeling.
The shameful thing is I've delayed and delayed and delayed. I expect many of you have had parental or letters from people that they are now dead and you don't know what to do with them. And I still don't know what to do. Any social historian will tell you, keep them. They're a record. And in 50 years' time, 100 years' time, nobody will know who your parents were. They will be specimens of what life was like. And so there's a sort of pressure. They're precious as documents, particularly in our age of email when such things get fewer and fewer.
Yeah.
At the same time, I know that my father would be horrified if he felt they were coming into the public domain.
I've got to ask you nosily about whether all these belief systems you've encountered, because these countries you love, people believe in things, have rubbed off on you.
When I was a teenager, I think I was quite strongly Christian. I lost it very specifically because of the death of my sister. I sort of left it behind. There were things that I didn't love about the kind of Christianity I was fed at Eton.
Yeah.
Not that it was forced on you, but it was very much part of the system. And became interested in Islam and Buddhism. There seemed to be so many varieties of belief that I found it very hard to believe in just one, or eventually perhaps to believe in any. And so I was more agnostic than atheist. I wouldn't declare there's no God. I would only say that I've found it hard to discover him or her. So that is the trajectory, really. Mongolia, Russia, China, Russia, Russia again. And I think we can probably leave it at there.
Where do you want to go next? Where would you most like to go if you had a year or two?
I'm so glad when somebody asks me that, because most people say, you're surely finished, aren't you? So I'm very glad. The answer is I don't know. I usually write a novel between the travel books. If I had to write one travel book after another, I think I would tire and maybe artificially be thinking too hard about where next, as if I stare at an atlas. I like the destination to seem to choose me rather than the other way around. So I don't know where I'll travel next. In a way, to travel in the Amur River, it's where these two great ex-communist giants, Russia and China, have their limit. It would seem to be a natural end for somebody whose working life has mainly been in the area of the old Soviet Union, Central Asia, China. But I hope there'll be another book, another travel.
I've got one last booksellery question, which is, what was your childhood comfort book, and what would now be your desert island book? I'm sorry to put you on the spot. What was your childhood comfort book? Is it something like Jock of the Bush Belt, or?
No. I think I had a number of books on chivalry, King Arthur and his knights, and these sort of things, which were very influential. I hope I didn't emulate the Knight Errant, but I did. It was those sort of the Greek myths. They were not. I don't think there's one very potent book. As to what I'd choose.
In 1986, it was a Victor Gollancz anthology of, I think, mystical writing.
Yes, it was. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't mind that as a choice.
Compliment. All right then. Well, are there any questions?
So when the horses ran off with your luggage, they didn't run off with your money?
No, they ran off with our food.
Are there travel literary circles?
I wouldn't say there's a circle exactly. You tend to meet people in the same field. If you live in London in particular, I know Paul Theroux, I knew Bruce Chatwin, but not intimately, and I wouldn't say they affected me. It's not as if we sat about talking together about travel writing. You find authors don't do that. They tend just to complain about their agents when they're together, or their publishers, and they're not really talking about the other. Yes, and some of the younger travel writers I like, like Rory MacLean or Philip Marsden. One knows them, but not exactly like a social circle.
I can't resist asking what Chatwin was like. Annoying?
He divided his life up, Chatwin. I belonged in the travel section, and he was opaque. You didn't know. He was a production. He was very conscious of his image.
Yeah.
He was fascinating. He was great fun, and there's always a passion about him, a sort of intellectual passion. I've got a number of letters from him about how he was. He'd pick up the telephone out of the blue, out of months of silence, and say, "Colin, I've just been at Schwarzkopf in South Africa, and I've been at the first known site of Neolithic fire. I've got holding the embers in my hand, and goodbye."
Did you always believe him? Did you credit?
Yes, mainly. So he was very stimulating.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
I just wonder if there's ever any willingness on your part to stay in touch with some of these people.
An awful lot of the people I meet, they're not perhaps illiterate, but they wouldn't feel comfortable with even an email correspondence. I have, in the case of this book, there are two that I have kept in touch with. In the old Soviet days, you had to be very careful about being in touch with anybody. Occasionally, I both those two characters, I sent the chapters to them for their vetting to have a look at, to make sure I'd been accurate and that there was nothing there that they found offensive. In other cases, for instance, I went back in Central Asia to the town of Bukhara, where I'd met a family, and they had actually read the book on Central Asia. And I always remember that the young wife of the family said that her mother-in-law was very angry with me for what I'd written about her in the book. The old lady was sitting out on the veranda with her back to me, and I thought, oh dear, what I'd written was that she was a fervent Communist Party member, and her husband and her father had both been killed basically by Stalin, and yet she remained a passionate party member, and how grotesque this was in a way. or how incomprehensible to our way of thinking. Anyway, there she was with her back to me, and I thought, oh dear, I've offended her terribly. But when I asked what she had found so offensive in the book, was that I had apparently written that she got a bandaged leg, and her vanity was upset. She didn't mind about Stalin or the Gulag or her husband or her father or anything else. It was just this bandaged leg.
Fantastic. I'd like to thank you all for coming and your questions. I wish there could be more. And thank you very much.
And for Norman. Hello. I just finished your book on Siberia and Latham. I'm looking forward to
Hello, Colin. Are you still in the Damascus?
17.
Maybe like this. See yourself as
Yes.